Yeah, so where did this start? What happened about 1 year ago? We were contacted by the Dutch NCSC, and they wanted to have kind of a study on how threat modeling is conducted in organizations that they give advice to. So they asked us, can you do such a study? And as academics, of course, we're always happy to do such a thing. So we said yes, so that's when this thing got rolling. So first maybe a bit about myself, who am I? So I'm a research manager on secure software engineering at Distrinet KU Leuven in Belgium. And I have 15 years of research experience on topics like automated threat modeling, security by design, secure design patterns, model-driven security, and empirical research on secure software design. So this research is kind of a nice mixture between the first and the past topic, empirical research on threat modeling. Somewhere in the past I did a PhD on the use of security patterns, which is related to these topics, but not really relevant for me. I'm not doing this by myself. There are some other people in Leuven also involved. I think the mic went off. Is it back? It's flickering. Yeah. Switch to the back of this one. Yeah. So I'm not doing this by myself, not doing this alone. There's Laura Sion, Stef Verret, and Professor Pauteriose also involved in this team. So what am I going to talk to you about today? It's first of all, for this whole process, what were the original goals? Talk to you a bit about what the process was, what we went through, give you a sneak preview at some of the preliminary results, and talk a bit about where we would like to take this further. So starting with the goals that were actually, we set up in collaboration with the NCSC, we set up 4 research questions that we wanted to answer. So the first one is, where and how does threat modeling fit within the organizations, within the companies? The second one is, who is involved in threat modeling? The third one is, how is threat modeling conducted in practice? What are the procedures, the models, etc.? And the last one are the opinions, the experiences of the people involved. How did they experience this? How does this work? So a bit more concretely, so how does it fit in the organization? A first good question there is already, what is threat modeling for these people? How do they see it? How do they define it? Why does the organization or the security people, why do they do it? What's the main reason for doing threat modeling? And then, who uses the results? This is really about threat modeling as kind of a black box interfacing with the rest of the company. What are these interfaces? How are the results used? Etc. Second question is, who is involved in threat modeling? We started with more of a general question, like who introduced threat modeling? What was the trigger to first start doing threat modeling within these organizations? Who participates in the activity, in the actual threat modeling exercises? And a last one that was interesting to us is, what is the role or involvement of, or the support of management in threat modeling? Third research question is more about the practicalities. So how is threat modeling done in practice? What are the main steps that are followed? What kind of models are used? What documents are created? What is in those documents? How are those documents used? And last question there is about the quality of the threat models. Is there some kind of quality assurance for the threat model? And then the last question was about the experiences. So are there good and bad experiences? What are the main success experiences? And what are the main challenges that are perceived by the participants? So the population that we want to study, if you do a study, you always have to define your population. And the current population for this study are people, organizations within the target audience of the NCSC, more specifically organizations, let's say, within critical sectors for for the Netherlands. So think about energy, health, finance, telecom, transport, all critical sectors. The original idea of the study was to focus more on, like, let's say, an operational technology environment, OT, industrial control system-alike things. How is treadmilling done in these organizations? But we kind of quickly noticed that we had to broaden this because it was very difficult to find people to talk to about treadmilling in these industries, which by itself might already be an indication of what might be going on. Okay, so a quick run through the process. How does this go? So we don't just go unprepared to somebody and start asking them some questions and hope that we will get the answers that we want. No, if we want to do thorough research, the idea is to have this as an academic research project, is to do qualitative interviewing the way we should. So that starts with formulating the research questions. We saw them, so we have those. We have to have a recruitment strategy. We have to compose informed consent forms for the participants to sign. We have to go through an ethical review at our university before we can actually start interviewing people. Then we collect the data, so we go out in the field, talk to people, or use a Zoom or a Teams call. So we recruit, we conduct the interviews, then the laborious part comes, and that's the transcription. Writing these things down, anonymizing the transcripts, and then the last stage is the actual analysis of the data. So going through the transcripts, coding all the stuff, grouping everything, all the observations, and coming to conclusions. At this point, we have had some delays, especially in this first part, to get to this final approval. At this point, we're here near the end of the transcription phase. So we have the interviews that we want, we have transcribed them, but we still have to do the thorough analysis. Okay. A bit more in detail on what happened for the ethical review. So what we have to do to get such an ethical review, you first have to go through kind of a risk assessment. You have to say, these are the benefits for society that we expect from this study. These are the risks that we see for the potential participants that go into the study, and these things are balanced. In this case, because it's about company processes, the risks were not that high. It's a bit different, of course, if you start interviewing people about their personal lives. So this was not really a problem. The main thing where this ethical review really helps is before you can start contacting your first participant, you need to have that approval. And to get that approval, you need to explain the whole process. So they want to see everything, the exact consent form that you will hand over to the participants, the mails that you will send to recruit them. They want to see everything to make sure that you follow the guidelines. So that's good, because once you have that ethical review done, the study is basically designed. You cannot change too much, and everything is well prepared. Then for the recruiting, the ideal case would be you open your phone book and you have all the contacts of the population in there, and you start randomly sampling them. You contact them, they all say yes, they come to you, and you can do the interview. Unfortunately, that didn't really work for us, especially as academics. We do not know all the industry people involved in security or treadmilling, find the right people. You just don't know them. You cannot just mail a company at their info address to say, I would like to speak to people that do treadmilling. That will not get you very far. So you need a way to go to the right people or somebody close to the right persons immediately. So here, this is what really helped us, was that NCSC had some of these contacts, or a lot of these contacts, so we could use them to go there. But of course, we also have to be aware this introduces bias, because we're now limited to people that NCSC knows, and there might be others that don't know about the study that do not participate. For research like this, finding participants, finding the right people to interview is the number one challenge for us as academics. And for the interviews themselves, what happened? So we followed a semi-structured responsive interviewing, which means we have a preparation of things that we like to talk about, and then we go into a conversation and we see where we go. We don't have to follow the strict questions. It's not a survey. It's not an interrogation. It's really a conversation to get to know the opinion of the other participant. At first, we wanted to do all the interviews in person because there is, it's just more fun. It's easier to make a connection with a person if you physically go there and you can talk and you can go for a coffee and you can say some things offline. Whereas in a meeting online, especially with somebody that you don't know, you see them there and then you start the interview, but it's not really that easy to do. On the other hand, the in-person thing requires a lot of planning. You have to schedule an appointment. People have to be in the office. We have to make sure that we get the train tickets. It costs a full day, whereas a Zoom meeting, you can say this specific hour and you just do it, and 1 hour later you can do something else. So we kind of backtracked a bit on that. So we prefer the in-person, but the online worked as well for us for this kind of thing. To make transcriptions and to not having to note down everything, we took audio recordings of all the interviews, and each interview lasted about 1 hour. Sometimes we had an interview with two people at the same time that usually took a bit longer. This 1 hour proved to be, given the number of research questions that we had, this 1 hour was a bit on the short end, let's say. There was a lot more to be discussed. On the other hand, of course, it's we're already happy that people want to talk to us for 1 hour. If we go to 2 or 3 hour interviews, that will become a big burden on the person giving the interview. Then there's the transcription, and this thing is very, very laborious. I don't know whether anybody has experience with this. So we didn't start from scratch. We used AI support where we upload the audio file and it gives us the transcription. But even then, it's full of mistakes. You have to edit this. You have to listen to the recording, listen again, rewind a few seconds, listen again, update the text, etc. So in our experience, it's about 4 to 6 hours per recorded hour of audio to write this out. And then ideally you would have somebody else listen to the audio while reading the transcript to make sure that you did this correct. So we kind of underestimated this. If you go forward with more interviews, we're thinking about outsourcing this. On the other hand, it's a very good way to already get acquainted with your data, of course. You're not just reading the transcript that somebody else made, but you're going through this more than once. There are a lot of technical terms that I'm not sure if we outsource it to a third party that can do transcriptions, but that don't know the domain. We will still need to do that quality check, go through it, and edit some terms. So it's a bit of a trade-off, but it's the most tedious part. Okay, so that's where we were. So we'll now go to some preliminary results. And that goes with a big disclaimer. These are preliminary based on the recollections that we had from transcribing and from the interviews themselves. So, as I said before, we didn't do the full analysis yet. We still have to code. There might be some things in there that came more easily to mind, and we might have forgotten some others. So, conclusions are not fixed yet, but they're based on what we remember from the interviews. At this point, we have 9 participants from 4 large organizations in critical sectors, and most of these participants focused on IT. So I said in the beginning we wanted to do IT or OT even more than IT, but we didn't find that much participants. We have one participant. It's representative, I think, at this point. All of our participants have practical experience with threat modeling in the organization. They're actually there in the room when it happens. They're not talking about what they think happens. They were actually there. But you can kind of consider them, most of these participants were the one that introduced or helped introduce it to the rest of the security teams. So you might consider them as kind of threat modeling champions within the organizations. So, yeah, they believe in threat modeling and they try to carry it out.
How much did you need to contact to get, huh?
How much did we need to contact? Because we had the contacts through NCSC, this was actually rather good. I think there were one or two participants, I think, or two contacts that didn't reply or that we didn't get anything for, which is a very good rate, I think. Given usual interviews or surveys, they typically talk about 10 to 20% that actually participates in the rest drops out. So, in that respect, these are good numbers. But what I don't know, and I will ask that to the people at NCSC, is how many people did NCSC contact to ask if they were interested before they sent the contact to us? Because it might be that there are a lot more there.
Influenced it.
Yeah, I heard that there are people that say we don't do that much in our organization, so we don't really want to talk about it. So we didn't get those names, and that's unfortunate because then you get this bottom bias. Of course, you get the companies that already do a bit of threat modeling and that are happy to talk about it, and that might give, let's say, a more positive picture than what would be there if you sampled all the organizations that have it.
Good, a question from my side. So, even if this is preliminary results, right? How are you, as a researcher, thinking about compensating the bias? Come up to actual results and conclusions, we should know that it's probably no bias.
We cannot compensate the bias, we can only be aware of it and explicitly state it, I think. One way to do this would be to go to a random sample and check whether these things are still similar or not. There are a few other papers on this topic as well, so that's the second thing. I will come back to that later to cross-check to see whether the findings that we have agree with other papers or contradict them in some way. That might be another way, but yeah, it's very hard to fight this bias, but it's important to be aware of it and to also interpret results in that respect. So this will not be a report on Dutch companies, but this will be a report on Dutch companies where threat modeling has been introduced, has been done for a few years, and where people are happy to talk about it, which already narrows the scope.
We also ask to say, okay, whoever filled that platform, please talk to us.
Yes, and I will do that later. So what answers did we get for the first research question on how does threat modeling fit in the organization? So what is threat modeling? A few of the definitions from participants. There are, let's say the one I would have expected more, the way to systematically map threats and vulnerabilities serving as a basis for mitigations. The second one is also interesting, came back a lot. It's a way for the team to start actively thinking about security for their specific application that they're building. Another definition is to find out where threats are coming from, who the threat actors are, and modeling the ways in which they can penetrate your system. And another one also interesting for us was threat modeling is the start of the security testing project. Whereas typically you would see this perhaps at other ends, threat modeling about the design and testing at the very end. With threat modeling and security testing, there were a lot of links mentioned in the interviews between these two activities. Some other findings. In most of the companies that we interviewed, threat modeling was introduced a few years ago. So 2018, 19, 17 maybe, that's kind of the time scale in which they started doing threat modeling. So it's 3, 4, 5 years maybe, but not 10 years or 20 years. We didn't hear that. Sometimes the company has a policy on threat modeling for critical applications. They say if your application, if you do a quick risk assessment and your application becomes critical in one or more dimensions, you have to do threat modeling. But that didn't happen very often. In a lot of cases, threat modeling was more used as a first introduction or an awareness tool to get security to the development teams, and not so much as a security analysis activity. As I said before, there was a link between threat modeling and pen testing. So threat modeling is often an input for pen tests, or people said the other way around. If we have to do a pen test, then the first thing the pen testers would normally do is sketch the system, see what the scope is, see what might be interesting, and start looking. So they're kind of starting with a threat model anyway. If you have it, give it to the pen testers so they know where to start. In contrast to the threat modeling, the pen tests usually are required in the company. So there is a requirement that you get the yearly pen test for your application, for your product. We have also heard stories where threat modeling is not used for testing, but for example to create the security requirements in a tender. They wanted to buy something. By first doing a threat model, where will this thing that we buy end up in our system? What will it interface with? It was possible to make better security requirements to write in the tender. That was another use of threat modeling which we found rather interesting. Something we also heard a lot is that once the threat modeling exercise with the help of the security expert is over, the document is owned by the team, the development team, and they are responsible for following up. There isn't that much interaction anymore on following up the findings of the threat modeling. And the role of management, sometimes they are present or they want to know something, but in general there was very little interest in the actual precise results of the threat modeling from management. Who is involved? Start with the introduction. Usually threat modeling is introduced in the organization by a member of the security team. So all these organizations, they're large enough to have their own security department, security team. Somebody from the security team knows threat modeling from somewhere. A lot of cases we heard that they said, we first did consulting somewhere else and we brought that knowledge in and we tried to introduce it here. So that's the way it usually gets introduced. Getting in external experts to bootstrap that process was also something that was mentioned a few times as something helpful. Because then you don't have that fixed place in the company or the forces that play within the company. Sometimes it's useful to get somebody external in that doesn't suffer from this context. The actors of threat modeling are usually the development team, including the product owner. Most of the participants said that basically everybody is welcome, the more the better, but participation of these others is less, which is not that strange. I think the development teams, of course, know the application best. And there's usually the security experts from the security team present there as well. That security expert remains necessary in a lot of cases. So there's, let's say, kind of a hope to get these teams to become self-supporting in terms of threat modeling and security. You do it once and then they can start doing it on their own. But there is the lack of security knowledge that hampers them from doing that. So the security expert, the person from the security department gets called in more often than they would actually like it to be. And that's mainly because of the knowledge that the teams don't have. And as said before, management, if they are present, they have kind of a passive role if they are against that. How do they do it in practice? And here, results were actually really similar across all the companies. Like I said, mandatory for some applications, but in a lot of cases, it's the security team. It kind of markets threat modeling as something they have to offer to the development teams. So the development teams can ask to help them with threat modeling, and then the security team comes in and they try to push it, but there's no strong force that the teams have to do it, unless sometimes for critical applications. In practice, it's mostly done in dedicated sessions, not too long, 1 hour, 2 hours maybe, let's say 1 afternoon at most. Dedicated sessions where they sketch the architecture, in a lot of cases using data flow diagrams, and do some variant of stride. As academics, we know there is something like stride per element, where you go over each element and do a cross-check of each thread versus each element, and that's a kind of complete way to do it. We never saw that in practice. So this was mostly based on, let's say, gut feeling on where the juicy parts of the applications were, or kind of in a brainstorming way. But stride was often used as an acronym to think of these are the 6 threads that you have to keep in mind. The outcome is a document with that diagram. It's a list of the most important threats and proposed mitigations. Priorities and risk assessment of these threats were found to be very difficult. So sometimes they happen, but they're not always that important, or they don't do that much with those assessments. Tools were not used very often. Sometimes to draw a data flow diagram, or but most that we saw was whiteboards and, let's say, Word documents to document the result. And, like I said before, the follow-up of these threat models is kind of limited. So that document gets made, it's owned by the team, they can do whatever they want. Sometimes there's a link with an issue tracker, but not always, but it becomes a responsibility of the team. In terms of quality assurance, so do we draw the right model? Did we do enough work on the stride to find the most important threats? There weren't really that much concrete processes in place. So it was more of a, let's say, we're happy that it happens at least once. With the model, we have the team there. Some things might pop up, but there's no real quality assurance for threat model. There was one exception, and that's the OT, and there, of course, I have to warn because we only have one participant there, so this might be an outlier, but this was interesting for us to see. Previous results were kind of common across all the IT organizations that we saw, with the IT departments. For OT, threat modeling was more about, let's say, a network-centric architecture, so what connects to what, where are the firewalls, drawn again by discussing with the teams or the members that know about them, and then identifying potential entry points and defenses. So what do we want to do? Which entry points do we want to scrap? Instead of stride, they used, let's say, safety or risk-inspired techniques. So in this particular case, bow ties, which come from the safety world, but were here then applied to security. And the focus was not that much on what you typically see with stride or security, but it was really on isolating and containing these core assets. So the physical process that is managed by this OT infrastructure was really about this interview. There was a lot of talk about the IT department wants to connect everything. They want to put IT on top of everything. They want everything to be on the internet. And as the OT security guy said, I don't want that, so our focus is on isolating this as much as possible, reducing all these entry points so that we know where they are and that we can do proper access.
So I have a feeling that this exception also comes because threat modeling consumption happens in security teams. While the others would say, okay, we want the developers to understand.
One of the things here, of course, is in this OT, it's a lot more about composing, let's say, machines or controllers or whatever. You buy them from a vendor and you put them all in your network, but you're not actually doing much development yourself. You rely on the vendor, and you hope that the vendor or the software guys of the vendor do then the threat modeling. And here it's a bit different.
And actually, this is more or less in line with what IEC 6443 states. You first do a risk analysis of your whole system under consideration. It's called the standard. So you look at the system, in this case, the industrial system as a whole, and see where the risks are. So I think this might come from using that standard.
Yeah. So this is one of the things where we think we want to grow this NS1 doesn't tell us very much. So definitely in this area we'd like to know more about how is threat modeling, or something that maybe they don't call it threat modeling, but they still do it, but how is it conceived there? Okay, experiences. What we initially thought was that in success experiences we would get some war stories like we did threat modeling, and because of the threat modeling there was this large attack that that didn't work for us. We detected that they were trying, but it didn't work. Actually, we didn't get a lot of those. I think one case this happened. Yeah.
Maybe because it's not because of lack of visibility, but they're not looking for us, right? Because they assume they are defenders. That's where the bias creeps in. You don't look at what you are defending. Yeah. Like, this is the data because we're okay.
Yeah.
Or you so good that it didn't happen anymore.
You don't know if it happened. People don't even know if it happened.
You don't know for sure. And of course, if your threat model leads to a redesign where some threat is eliminated altogether, then of course it's very difficult to say we prevented an attack because we redesigned the system. Yeah, of course, if you can't do it anymore, if you removed the entry point, then nobody can attack that entry point. So it's difficult to measure. That's for sure. So we didn't get a lot of that. What we did get were that the main successes were framed in terms of the teams becoming more secure aware. So the fact that they went to the teams and that the team said, okay, now I got an idea of how to think more like an attacker about my system, what possible security problems could be. Those were typically framed as successes. For the OT, again, there was kind of an exception. There the success was really, let's say, the fight against the IT department, finding ways to isolate that OT infrastructure while still supporting in some way the business cases from IT. So if that is possible, that was a success there. The follow-up and that's really fast. The need for follow-up and use of results was mentioned a few times. So not having these documents end up in a drawer and not doing anything with it, but following them up. And the creation of that architectural model was a large effort and a big challenge most of the time. Okay. And then finally, and this is where we as researchers become very interested, there's a lack of empirical data on threat modeling. So actual studies that show you whether it works, how good it works, what would be the best way to do it. And this hinders distilling best practices, but also convincing others of the usefulness. If you have a study where you say, it really works, here's the proof, that would be easier to get it in.
Yeah, I also have experience with threat modeling in different organizations, and then I think my most important experience is that it is a one-time thing, and I don't see that coming back in your research, right? They do it once, and whenever the system grows, it's not revisited and redone. I think that's the experience I've seen in all the places where I've done threat modeling.
Okay, so to repeat, if you didn't hear, so the experience was that threat modeling is often a one-time thing. It's done once and then not repeated. And that's kind of, I didn't have it explicitly here, but it's kind of what we heard as well. So that's the follow-up of the results. You hope hope that the team will contact you again if they do a major refactoring, but if they don't, there's nothing that really stops.
So using architectural models than the DFD?
That's the DFD.
How come it's a lot of knowledge to take it into 30 minutes?
It shouldn't take a lot of effort, but it's very hard to find the right DFD or the right abstraction level for your system. So it's a simple model, but getting all the information of what really happens where, what is the right abstraction level, how do we draw this as a DFD so that we have all the relevant information for the security, but not too much information that we don't need, that came out as a challenge. It will depend from project to project, I guess. Sometimes DFD is similar to others, sometimes it will be very, very detailed.
Did they find functional issues as well? Because in my experience, if people are looking in a threat log, they also find functional issues.
I haven't heard any, we haven't asked for it of course, but I haven't heard any stories about identifying functional issues. What was mentioned sometimes is that during the threat modeling, even before you really do the analysis, some of the things pop out to be so bad, such a big security risk, that you immediately get sent back to fix that before even completing the whole exercise. So if there's really a glaring issue, this would probably cover it. Okay, I will go quickly over this. There are some limitations both to the study itself, given the sample size, the fact that we selected our participants, but also generalizing, so we focus on the critical sectors with large organizations, in-house security departments, so it might not apply to every organization, of course. As I said, there were some other papers as well, and we can compare. These are the findings of this paper, and I put a check mark next to the things that I recognized from our study. So done by developers as a separate activity. Difficult to find the right abstraction level in DFD, difficult to produce accurate models, and wise to involve a security expert there. And the tooling, one of the things that was mentioned sometimes was that if you use a tool to generate threats, it will generate a lot of irrelevant threats, and you can't really do much with that. There's another study more focused on OT and cyber-physical, and this is where it becomes interesting to see, did we interview a one-off, or is there some mixture going on? So here, there was mentioned, Strijd was mentioned a bit more often in this study, in the participants that they interviewed. This ISA standard, I think it was just mentioned, serves as the foundation for the whole exercise there. And also interesting to see is that integrity and availability in OT systems are much more important than confidentiality, whereas in IT systems, usually confidentiality goes very high on the list. Okay. So in summary, the teams do it during a dedicated session. It's perceived as accessible to create security awareness, perhaps even more than as a security analysis activity. So sometimes our hypothesis is steered towards, is threat modeling really done for analyzing the security of the system, or is it more something to get the developer teams to be aware of security without actually having the intent to improve the security during that session? That would also explain, for instance, why it's often done once but not repeated very often. Most popular techniques are no formal follow-up. Now, what I would like to say is that we plan to continue and extend the current interviews, so within the Netherlands, but we would also like to broaden it to Benelux and, if possible, Europe, including experiences of smaller organizations, not necessarily in critical sectors, security consultants, because now we also only interviewed people that were in the company, present in the company. It might also be useful to know, for example, Seva or others, what they do if they go to a company for threat modeling, and broaden to IT and especially OT. If you would be interested, or if you know somebody that might be able to help us in participating, doing an interview of 1 hour, There's a link here with the QR code. You can get there. You can drop us your email. You don't commit to anything by doing that. Just that we have your contact details. If we are looking for extra participants, we might send you an invitation. And then we need more empirical research on threat modeling. So what are the current practices and is it effective? So there is very little research on this. And as a scientist, I want to end with a more academic note. Science is about falsification. So you put an hypothesis and then you say, we're going to try to disprove this. If you make a statement like threat modeling is essential for security, or if you say threat modeling improves security, that statement by itself is unfalsifiable. So we as academics cannot check this. It's related to the fact that security is not observable and that this statement is too broad or not qualified. So if you say that, nobody can prove you wrong, but it also means that if somebody once says, I think threat modeling is a good idea, we should do it, and you start doing it, and there's no way to gather evidence to say, okay, we shouldn't have been doing it, or we should drop it. Similar things happened with password guidelines. Somebody thinks it's a good idea to require this, it sounds logical, you start doing it, and you can never get rid of it, because you cannot prove that it's essential or beneficial for security. So what we need to do is make a very precise statement, ask somebody who believes in threat modeling, what evidence would convince you that threat modeling does not work? If we do a study exactly as you say and we find no difference, you would accept that threat modeling doesn't work. Now this sounds very negative, but it really isn't. Because that tells us exactly what experiment we should do. And if we then do find a difference, it kind of corroborates the fact that it does help. But it prevents you from, if we come with no evidence, to say, yeah, but, you should have done this, or the developer such and such. No. You say up front, this would convince me. If you have ideas, talk to us. We would be willing to do this, but we need to know that you would be convinced by the result. And it's an intriguing question to ask yourself about anything you strongly believe in. So this is for threat modeling, but replace this by something else. It's fun to think about. Okay, so to conclude, our key observations. Threat modeling is often used to create security awareness. The integration in the organization is limited. DFD and Stride are the most popular ways of doing it. There's not really systematic follow-up of results, and tools are not used very often. And there's a lack of empirical research. If you want to cooperate in this, ping me or fill out the form. We've had a lot of questions already. I don't know if we have much time left.
One question.
One question. Yes?
If I may, I would like to hear Sebastian's comment on this album. It's modesty as well.
Respond to the last question again?
Anything that triggers your
I think a lot of what I see here, obviously it's a very so coming from teaching a lot about threat modeling and doing a lot of in practice or in Belgium also and with other customers, a lot of what you've noticed here is along the lines with what we see as well in practical threat modeling. I would say overall, although the difference. What indeed what we've also done is we do a lot of OT and IC security as well, and threat modeling there. And indeed, the more network point of view, that's also something that we represent. So it's I think, in line with what we see in practice. So no big surprises, I'd say. Sorry. Yeah. So it's as good as in Belgium.